Alex, a 13-year boy, stood at the entrance of the animal shelter. The rows of cages lined up against the walls seemed endless, each one home to a different dog. "Look at that one, Alex," his mom called, pointing to a little terrier puppy. The dog's fur was white and soft, and its tail wagged so fast it looked like it was going to fly off. "He looks like he'd be a great playmate for you." Alex smiled politely, but his eyes were already scanning the room for something else. His parents were suggesting the lively, playful dogs, but Alex wasn't sure if that's what he was looking for. He wanted something special, something more than just a dog who would fetch a ball or run around in the yard. Then he saw him. In the far corner of the shelter, hidden behind a row of cages, sat an older dog. Quiet and unassuming, he rested in his kennel with his dark eyes cast downward, avoiding any direct gaze. Larger than most of the other dogs, his body showed the unmistakable signs of age. The name on his tag read simply, Max. He was a golden retriever. Alex stood frozen for a moment, his heart sinking. There was something about Max that drew him in immediately, something that called out to him. The dog wasn't jumping or barking like the others. He wasn't trying to get anyone's attention. He was just there, quiet, alone. A shelter worker noticed Alex's gaze and walked over. "Ah, you found Max," she said, smiling kindly. "He's been here for a while, actually. He's a good dog, but he's a little shy, and he takes time to warm up to new people." Alex couldn't explain it, but he felt a connection to Max that was different from the other dogs. While the others seemed eager and full of energy, Max seemed tired, worn down, as though he had lived a life that was heavy on his heart. He didn't know why, but he felt this pull in his chest. He didn't want a dog just to play with or show off. He wanted a dog who needed him, who would understand what it was like to feel lonely. "I want him," Alex said without thinking, his voice steady, yet filled with a deep, quiet certainty. The worker raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Are you sure? He's not like the other dogs. He's going to take a lot of time and patience." "I'm sure," Alex said, nodding. "I can do it. I want him to be happy again." As they drove home, Max lay quietly in the back seat of the car, his large eyes staring out the window, distant and lost. Alex couldn't help but glance at him, wondering what Max had been through. The ride was silent, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Max shifting in his seat. Max hadn't shown any excitement when Alex had opened the kennel door. He hadn't jumped up or wagged his tail like the other dogs. He just stood there, slowly walking toward Alex as if unsure of what would happen next. And now, here he was, just quietly staring out the window, as though the world outside didn't matter to him. Alex wanted to say something, to make him feel better, but he didn't know how. Instead, he sat quietly, trying to respect the space Max needed, wondering if the dog felt as lonely as he did. When they arrived home, Alex opened the car door and stepped out, motioning for Max to follow. The older dog hesitated, sniffed the ground, and then cautiously padded out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate. Alex watched him, feeling a twinge of sadness at the way Max carried himself. He didn't seem like the playful dog Alex had imagined. He wasn't running around or exploring with excitement. Instead, Max seemed to drift, lost in his own thoughts. "Come on, Max," Alex said softly, trying to sound encouraging. "This is your new home. You're going to love it here." Max looked up at him for a moment, his eyes heavy with an emotion Alex couldn't quite place. Then, as if deciding it was safe, Max trotted slowly toward the house, his head low. Inside, Alex had already set up a cozy bed for Max in the living room, near the window. A few toys sat on the floor, a bowl of food and water were placed neatly beside the bed. Alex had even bought a collar with a tag that read, "Max Forever Loved." He had prepared for this moment for days, and now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to do next. Max wandered over to the bed and sniffed it cautiously. He circled it a few times before lying down, his body still, his eyes fixed on the door. Alex couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. He had imagined a joyful reunion, a happy dog bouncing around, wagging its tail. Instead, Max was lying down in complete silence, not even looking at Alex. Alex sat down on the floor beside him, gently rubbing the dog's back. "I know you're scared," he whispered, "but you don't have to be anymore. You're safe now, I promise." Max's eyes flickered for a moment, but he didn't respond. He didn't lift his head, didn't wag his tail. He simply stayed there, a silent presence in the room. Alex knew that Max wasn't rejecting him, he was just lost. The day passed slowly. Alex tried to get Max to eat, offering him treats and a few scraps of food, but the dog didn't seem interested. He sat quietly in his bed, staring out the window as though waiting for someone to return. Alex's heart sank. He knew it wasn't Max's fault. The dog had clearly been through something painful, but it was hard, really hard, to watch Max be so distant. He had hoped for a connection right away, for some sign that the dog understood that Alex cared. That night after dinner, Alex sat down next to Max's bed, watching the dog's unmoving form. "I'm not going to give up on you, Max," he whispered, as if the dog could hear him. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone anymore." Max looked up at him briefly, his eyes tired, almost resigned, before turning back toward the window. As the days passed, Alex kept trying. He took Max for walks around the neighborhood, but the dog walked slowly, his tail never wagging. He would sit at the park, staring out into the distance, not even interested in the other dogs who played nearby. It seemed like nothing Alex did could reach him. But Alex didn't give up. He would sit beside him, quietly, as Max stared out the window, hoping one day the dog would look at him, really look at him, and understand that he wasn't alone anymore. And then, one afternoon after weeks of quiet persistence, something small happened. Max lifted his head just for a moment as Alex sat next to him on the couch. His eyes met Alex's, and for the first time they weren't distant. They weren't full of sadness or emptiness. They were simply calm. Alex smiled softly, his heart swelling. "Hey buddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I think we're going to be okay." It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a start. Max hadn't wagged his tail or jumped into Alex's lap, but he had looked at him. He had acknowledged him, and that was enough for Alex. It was a small breakthrough, but it was a breakthrough nonetheless. Alex wasn't sure what had caused Max's silence, what kind of past had made the dog so guarded, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to give up on him. And maybe, just maybe, with enough time, patience, and love, Max would realize that he had finally found a place to call home. The first few days after Max came home felt like an eternity. Alex had expected fireworks, joyful barks, wagging tails, and maybe even the dog curling up next to him at night. What he didn't expect was the eerie silence that filled their home every time Max lay down in his bed, staring out the window like the world outside was more important than the one inside. It wasn't that Max was a bad dog. Far from it. He was gentle and well-behaved, but there was a sadness in his eyes that Alex couldn't shake off, a quiet, unspoken sorrow that seemed to hover over everything. Alex tried, he really did. He brought out all the toys he had bought, squeaky balls, ropes to tug, and frisbees. He thought maybe if Max had something fun to do, it might lift his spirits. But Max barely looked at the toys. He sniffed them briefly, then walked away, as though they were just strange, pointless objects. Max didn't play. He didn't beg for treats. He didn't bark at the neighbor's cat, even though Alex knew dogs loved to do that. Instead, Max just sat. And sometimes, he'd sit in the most unusual places, like by the front door, his head resting on his paws, gazing out into the yard. His eyes never seemed to focus on anything in particular, just lost in a place Alex couldn't reach. Alex would try to coax him to eat his meals. He'd put the bowl down in front of Max and wait, watching with hopeful eyes. But Max would sniff the food, then walk away, as though he wasn't hungry, as though it didn't matter. Alex's heart sank a little more each time this happened. His parents didn't seem as concerned. They'd smile kindly and reassure him that Max was just adjusting. "It takes time," his mom said. "He's probably just missing his old home." But Alex wasn't sure if that was all it was. There was something deeper, something Max was carrying with him, something Alex couldn't see but felt in every quiet moment they spent together. The days blended together, one after another, with little change. Max continued to sit by the door, staring outside. Alex's heart ached, wondering if he was failing. He wanted so badly to help, to fix whatever was broken inside of Max, but it felt like no matter what he did, Max remained unreachable. One afternoon after school, Alex found Max lying by the door again, his eyes distant, like he was waiting for something or someone. Alex crouched down beside him, scratching behind his ears gently. Max didn't respond, not even a flicker of interest. He just stayed still, his gaze locked on the door. "Why won't you look at me, Max?" Alex whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He never knew how hard it would be to love a dog who didn't seem to love you back. "I'm here for you. I just want you to be happy." Max's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't look up. Alex sat beside him for a long time, feeling the weight of the silence between them. He felt the tears start to well up in his eyes, but he wiped them away quickly. He couldn't give up. Max needed him, even if it didn't seem that way. That night, as Alex lay in bed, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He thought about what the shelter worker had said. Max had been in the shelter for a long time, and before that, there was that mystery about his previous owner. Alex hadn't asked for details yet, and maybe now was the time to find out more. It was hard not to wonder what had happened. Why did Max seem so withdrawn? What had he gone through that left him so distant, so unwilling to connect? Alex had tried to imagine what it would be like to lose everything, to feel like the world had slipped away, leaving you behind in an empty house, waiting for something that would never come. Alex turned over in bed and grabbed his phone, pulling up the shelter's contact information. He hesitated for a moment before dialing. He wasn't sure if it would help, but he had to know more about Max's past. The phone rang 3 times before someone picked up. "Hi, this is Lisa from the shelter. How can I help?" "Hi, it's Alex," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I adopted Max, the big dog with the gray coat. I was wondering, if you could tell me more about him, about his past." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course," Lisa said gently. "I'll tell you what I know." Alex sat up in bed, the phone pressed to his ear, as Lisa began to tell him the story. Max had been with his previous owner for a long time, she explained. He was adopted as a young puppy by an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who had lived alone in a small house at the edge of town. The man had adored Max, and the two had formed a deep bond over the years. Mr. Thompson would spend his days in his garden, tending to the flowers, while Max would lie in the sun nearby watching him. They were a quiet pair, content in their routines. But then, about 6 months ago, Mr. Thompson had passed away unexpectedly. Max had been there, waiting by his side when the paramedics arrived, but there was nothing they could do. After Mr. Thompson's death, Max had been taken in by a neighbor who tried to care for him, but the neighbor was unable to provide the same kind of home that Mr. Thompson had, and after a few months, they brought Max to the shelter. "That's all we know," Lisa said softly. "Max has been with us ever since, and we've seen him struggle to adjust. He's a good dog, but..." Losing Mr. Thompson hit him hard. Alex felt a lump form in his throat as he listened. He could barely imagine what Max had been through, losing the person he had loved and trusted, the person who had been everything to him. It made sense now. The sadness in Max's eyes, the way he seemed to be waiting for something. He wasn't just lost, he was mourning. "Thank you for telling me," Alex whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand him a little better now." "You're welcome," Lisa said, her voice warm. "I know it's hard, but Max will come around in time. He just needs someone who understands." Alex hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment, the weight of Max's past pressing down on him. He wasn't just a dog who needed a home, he was a dog who had lost everything. And now, Alex had to find a way to show him that he wasn't going to be left behind again. The next morning, Alex woke up early, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He quietly walked downstairs, where Max was lying in his bed, as usual. The dog didn't stir when Alex entered the room, but Alex didn't mind. Today was going to be different. Alex knelt down beside Max's bed and gently rubbed his back. "I know you're sad," he whispered, his voice soft and steady. "And I know you miss him, but you don't have to wait anymore. You don't have to be alone." Max's eyes flickered for a moment, just a brief glance toward Alex before returning to the window. But it was enough. It was the smallest acknowledgement, but it was there. And in that moment, Alex felt something shift between them. Maybe it wouldn't happen overnight. Maybe it would take time. But Alex was willing to wait. He wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time since Max arrived, Alex felt a spark of hope. It had been a week since Alex first learned about Max's past, and while he understood now why the dog seemed distant, it didn't make the silence any easier to bear. Max had been home for a full week, and still, it felt like the two of them were living in 2 separate worlds. Max still sat by the door, watching the world outside, as though waiting for something or someone to come back. The dog would occasionally lift his head when Alex spoke to him, but those moments were fleeting, and Max's attention would quickly return to the empty street outside. He wouldn't play, wouldn't eat, and wouldn't respond to any of Alex's attempts to get him to interact. Alex felt his heart breaking a little more each day, especially when he'd sit beside Max and talk to him about anything and everything. "I don't get it, Max," he would whisper. "I just want to make you happy. I don't know what else to do." But Max never answered, never gave any indication that he understood. The strain was starting to show. It wasn't just the silence, it was the feeling of helplessness creeping in. Alex had tried so hard to be patient, to respect Max's space, but after a week of this emotional distance, he couldn't help but wonder if Max would ever come around. One Saturday afternoon, after a long morning of trying and failing to get Max to play outside, Alex sat on the porch steps, feeling utterly defeated. The sun was warm on his face, but the weight in his chest felt heavy. Max, as usual, was lying in the yard, but he wasn't looking at Alex. His eyes were focused on the street beyond the fence, his tail motionless at his side. "You're not even trying, are you?" Alex muttered, his voice barely audible. He didn't mean to sound so angry, but it had been a long week. A week of walking on eggshells around Max, of doing everything he could think of, only to be met with indifference. It felt like Max was stuck in some kind of invisible cage, unable or unwilling to break free from his memories. Alex felt a tear slip down his cheek before he could stop it. "Why won't you just let me in, Max?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Max's head turned at the sound of Alex's voice, and for a split second, their eyes met. Alex's breath hitched in his throat. There was something different in Max's gaze, a flicker of emotion that Alex hadn't seen before. But before Alex could react, Max looked away again, turning back to stare out at the empty street. Alex wiped his tears away and stood up, brushing off his pants. "Fine. You want to stay out here alone? Go ahead." He didn't want to say it, but the frustration had built up too much inside of him. He felt the sting of rejection so acutely it was hard to breathe. Max didn't move, didn't acknowledge Alex's words. He just stayed there, lying still, as if nothing had changed. And that was the moment it all came crashing down. Alex felt like he might burst into pieces. Later that afternoon, Alex's parents noticed the tension that had been building in the house. They could sense it in the way Alex avoided eye contact, in the way Max lay silently in his bed, and in the strained atmosphere that lingered between them. "Alex, what's going on?" his mom asked gently, sitting next to him on the couch. "You've been so quiet today. Is everything okay with Max?" Alex stared at the floor, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. How could he explain the heartache of trying so hard to help a dog who wouldn't let him in? How could he tell his mom that he felt like he was failing? "He won't let me help him," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried everything, but it's like he's waiting for someone to come back. And I'm not that person. I'll never be that person." His mom's eyes softened, and she reached out, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Alex, I know you're trying so hard, but Max isn't going to heal in a day or a week. He's been through so much, and it's going to take time. He's not rejecting you, he's just lost." "But I'm not like Mr. Thompson." Alex's voice cracked and he had to stop himself from crying. "He doesn't want me. I can see it in his eyes. I don't know what to do." His mom took a deep breath and hugged him gently. "Sometimes love doesn't work the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's quiet, slow, and invisible. But it doesn't mean it's not there. You're doing your best, Alex. That's all you can do." Alex sniffed and wiped his eyes. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But the frustration and the feeling of being ignored was eating away at him. Max's silence felt like a rejection of everything Alex had hoped for. Everything he had dreamed about when he first imagined bringing Max home. He had wanted to save Max, to be the one to help him heal. But now, it felt like no matter how much love he gave, Max wouldn't even acknowledge it. That night, Alex went to bed feeling emptier than he had in days. It wasn't that he didn't love Max, it was that he didn't know how to reach him. How could you love someone who didn't know how to love you back? Alex lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions but no answers. Then, just before he drifted off to sleep, he heard a soft sound, a low whimper. Alex's heart leaped in his chest. It came from the living room. He jumped out of bed and crept quietly down the hallway, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. When he reached the living room, he found Max standing by the door, looking outside again. His body was tense, his tail flicking nervously. But it wasn't the same as before. This time Max wasn't still. He was moving, pacing back and forth, his eyes wide with unease. "Max?" Alex whispered softly, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's wrong?" Max stopped pacing and turned his head toward Alex. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, Alex with hope in his heart and Max with confusion in his eyes. And then, as if suddenly realizing something, Max let out a soft whimper again, looking at Alex with a silent plea in his eyes. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a jump, but it was something. Max was reaching out, slowly, tentatively, but it was a start. Alex knelt down in front of him, gently placing a hand on his back. "It's okay, Max," he whispered. "I'm here. You don't have to be scared anymore. I'm not going anywhere." Max didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. He simply stood there, leaning into Alex's touch. And for the first time in days, Alex felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Max was starting to trust him. He wasn't there yet, but this was the beginning. And for Alex, that was enough to hold on to. It had been a few weeks since Max had come home with Alex, and while the silence between them had started to lessen, the distance still remained. Alex had learned to be patient, but some days it felt like that patience was being stretched to its limit. Max's withdrawn behavior, His distant stares and his reluctance to engage with Alex continued to pull at his heart, but something was different now. Max no longer spent every moment staring out the door, lost in his memories. The pacing, the silent whimpering, it had all been replaced by something softer, quieter. Max still didn't play, but he had started to move around the house more, his body language a little less tense, a little more at ease. It wasn't a huge change, but for Alex, it was a sign that maybe things were starting to shift. Alex had been sitting in the living room, working on his homework one evening when he felt the warmth of a presence beside him. Max had always kept his distance before, lying on the floor or in his bed across the room. But tonight, something had changed. Without thinking, Alex glanced over at Max, who had moved from his usual spot and was now lying on the floor near the couch. Max wasn't looking out the window or pacing, he was just lying there, his head resting on his paws, watching Alex quietly. The dog's gaze didn't seem as lost or far away as it once did. It was subtle, but Alex could tell. Max was present. Max was here, in this moment, with him. Alex smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. The next day, Alex decided to take Max for a walk around the neighborhood. It had become part of their routine, but Max still seemed hesitant at times, pulling away from other dogs or strangers they passed on the street. Alex didn't mind. He didn't expect Max to suddenly become the most outgoing dog. He just wanted to give him the chance to experience the world on his own terms, at his own pace. As they walked through the park, Alex noticed Max stop at a small patch of grass. The dog sniffed the ground curiously, his tail twitching ever so slightly. Alex stopped beside him, bending down to scratch behind his ears. "Good boy, Max," Alex said softly, feeling a rush of affection for the dog. "I know this isn't easy for you, but you're doing great." Max glanced up at him, and for a moment, Alex thought he saw the tiniest glimmer of something in Max's eyes. It wasn't much, a flicker of recognition maybe, or a hint of trust. But it was there, and that was the moment Alex knew something had shifted inside of Max. It wasn't just the actions or the outward signs, it was the quiet understanding, the way Max was slowly starting to trust again. Over the next few weeks, there were more moments like that, small steps. Max would stand a little closer to Alex when he got home from school. He would lie next to him on the couch, his body no longer stiff with anxiety, but relaxed, at ease in Alex's presence. He still didn't jump or bark in excitement the way some dogs did, but Alex could feel the difference. Max was learning to trust him in his own way. He was learning to belong. There were also more signs of Max's old personality beginning to peek through, although they were still faint. One evening, as Alex was tossing a ball across the yard, he saw Max's ears perk up. The dog trotted over, sniffing the ball, and for a moment, Alex thought Max might actually play. But then Max just stared at the ball, his tail flicking back and forth, as if uncertain. He nudged it with his nose, but when Alex gently tossed it again, Max just stood there, watching it roll away. Alex laughed softly, his voice full of warmth. "Well, I guess we're not quite there yet, huh?" But as he walked over to retrieve the ball, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Max was making progress, even if it was slower than Alex had hoped. And that, for now, was enough. One night, as Alex sat reading in his room, he heard a soft scratching sound at his door. He looked up, and there, standing hesitantly at the threshold, was Max. The dog's eyes flickered toward Alex before looking down at the floor, his tail tucked between his legs. He stood there for a few moments, unsure, as if asking for permission. Alex set his book down and smiled, his heart swelling. "You want to come in?" Max's eyes lifted, and he took a small step forward. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Alex reached out, gently patting the floor next to him. "Come on, Max, it's okay." Max approached slowly, as if testing the waters before lying down next to Alex's bed. He wasn't in his usual spot by the door or on the couch. He was here, in Alex's room, close to him. Alex reached out, scratching behind Max's ears, his voice soft and soothing. "You don't have to be scared, Max. You can stay as long as you want." For the first time since Max had come home, Alex didn't feel the distance between them. Max was there, in the room with him, as close as he had ever been. And for Alex, that felt like a huge step forward. It wasn't a big change, and it certainly wasn't the joyful, carefree bond Alex had imagined when he first brought Max home. But as the days passed, Alex learned to appreciate the small moments, the quiet acceptance, the gentle steps toward trust. Max wasn't fixed, and Alex knew it would take time for him to fully heal from the pain of his past. But that was okay. Alex had always known it would be a long journey, What mattered was that they were walking it together, one step at a time. The quiet moments had become a kind of routine for Alex and Max, and for the first time in weeks, Alex felt like he was truly starting to understand the dog. Max's small steps forward had been encouraging, and every time the dog leaned into him, every time he stayed close, Alex felt like he was making progress. But the thing about healing, whether human or animal, is that it's rarely linear. One chilly evening in early autumn, after school, Alex returned home to find Max acting strangely. When he stepped inside, the dog was pacing in circles, his body tense, his tail low, his eyes darting around the house as though he was looking for something, or someone, who wasn't there. Max's behavior was uncharacteristically erratic. He didn't greet Alex with his usual calm, and he wasn't even lying on the floor as he normally would. "Max?" Alex called softly, but the dog didn't respond. Max's ears were flattened against his head, and he looked agitated, like a pressure cooker about to burst. It was the first time in weeks that Max seemed truly unsettled, and it sent a wave of panic through Alex's chest. He set his bag down quickly and knelt down, reaching out cautiously. "Hey buddy, what's wrong?" Max didn't respond. He whined softly and darted back toward the door, his body tight with unease. Alex's stomach dropped. Was something wrong? Was Max reliving something painful from his past? "Max," Alex said, his voice soft but full of worry. He reached out, trying to calm the dog, but Max recoiled. He turned and began pacing again, his movements faster, more frantic. It was clear that something had triggered the dog's anxiety, but Alex couldn't figure out what. That night, as the storm clouds gathered outside and the wind howled through the trees, Max's behavior didn't improve. He spent the entire evening pacing, whimpering, and occasionally barking at the door, as if trying to get outside. His eyes were wide with fear, and Alex could see the tension in his muscles. It was like Max was reliving something that terrified him deeply. Alex couldn't stand seeing him this way. He didn't know what had triggered the relapse, but he felt helpless. It was as if all the progress they had made had vanished in a heartbeat. "Max, come here," Alex said softly, though his voice trembled. The dog's ears perked up, but instead of coming over, Max backed up into the corner of the living room, his body stiff with fear. His breathing was heavy, quick. Alex's heart broke. He didn't understand what was happening. Was Max in pain? Was he thinking about his old life? The thought of Max reliving whatever horrors had led him to the shelter made Alex sick to his stomach. The following days weren't much better. Max's anxiety continued, and Alex could barely get him to eat or drink. The dog wouldn't go outside, wouldn't sleep in his bed, and seemed unable to relax. Alex did everything he could to comfort him, but it was as though Max had withdrawn into himself again, retreating into the shell he had once lived in before Alex had come into his life. "I don't know what to do," Alex said quietly to his mom one evening, sitting at the kitchen table. He had been trying to coax Max into eating for hours, but the dog just wasn't responding. It's like he's back to square one. His mom looked at him with soft eyes. "You're not alone in this, Alex," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes it's going to feel like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But that doesn't mean you've lost all that progress." "I don't know if I can do this," Alex admitted, his voice tight. "I just want Max to be happy, but he's not." His mom walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to fix everything right now. You're helping him more than you realize. Max has been through a lot, and it's going to take time. You're doing the best you can, and that's enough." But even as Alex tried to hold on to his mom's words, the doubt in his heart grew heavier. How much longer could he keep going like this? It wasn't just the exhaustion from trying to comfort Max. It was the emotional weight of it all. Max wasn't getting better as quickly as Alex had hoped. In fact, it sometimes felt like things were getting worse. One evening, after Max had refused to go outside once again, Alex sank down on the couch, feeling defeated. Max was lying in his bed across the room, staring blankly at the wall. His body was stiff, and his eyes were distant. Alex stared at him, his heart aching. "I don't know what else I can do, Max," he whispered, though Max didn't react. "I'm trying so hard, but I don't know if you'll ever trust me." But then, just when Alex felt like he might break under the weight of it all, something unexpected happened. Max, who had been lying still in his bed for hours, slowly lifted his head. He didn't move at first, just stared at Alex with those deep, brown eyes. And then, slowly, Max began to stand up. Alex's heart skipped a beat. Was he finally going to approach him? Max took a few shaky steps, his tail low, his body still tense, but he moved closer to Alex, inch by inch. He didn't bark or jump up on the couch, but he came close enough that Alex could feel the warmth of his body. The dog sat down beside him, his head tilted up, watching Alex with a mixture of caution and curiosity. Alex held his breath. He didn't want to move, didn't want to scare Max away. He just sat there, waiting. And then, after a long moment, Max reached out and gently placed his paw on Alex's leg. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but for Alex, it was everything. Max had reached out to him despite his fear, despite the turmoil in his heart. It was the first real connection they had made since the relapse, and it gave Alex the strength he needed to keep going. "Good boy, Max," Alex whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you." Max stayed by his side for the rest of the evening, lying quietly beside Alex as he read. It wasn't a breakthrough, but it was a sign. Max was still trying, still reaching out, and that, for Alex, was enough. Around midnight, Alex was woken by a soft whine. He blinked in the darkness, unsure at first, but then he heard it again. A low, heart-wrenching cry. His chest tightened as he quickly rushed to Max's side, who was standing at the door, trembling with anxiety, eyes wide and searching. Max was frightened, disoriented, his body stiff with tension. Something was wrong. "Max?" Alex whispered, crouching down to the dog's level. "What's wrong, buddy?" The dog let out another soft whine, his eyes flicking to Alex, then back to the door. Max was trapped in fear, unable to understand that the safety Alex wanted to offer was right there. For a long moment, Max just stood there, frozen, unsure of how to ask for the comfort he needed. But then finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Max took a step forward, his body still shaking. He pressed his head gently into Alex's hand, a hesitant but undeniable sign that he wanted to be close, to trust. Alex's heart broke as he knelt beside Max, rubbing his ears softly. "You're okay, Max. I'm here. You're safe with me." In that quiet moment, something in both of them shifted. Max wasn't healed. He wasn't whole. But he had reached out, and Alex had responded with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words. Max was trying, and Alex, despite his doubt, was trying too. The next morning, when Alex awoke, he found Max curled at the foot of his bed, calm and peaceful. For the first time in a long while, Max wasn't anxious. The dog wasn't healed, but the trust that had been built in that fragile, quiet moment had shifted something in both of them. They weren't perfect, and the road ahead would be long. But that small gesture, Max reaching out for comfort, and Alex offering it, spoke of something greater than both of them. It wasn't a grand breakthrough, but it was a step forward. And sometimes in the quiet moments of struggle, that was enough. Max wasn't fixed. He wasn't the playful, energetic dog Alex had hoped for. But he was trying, and for Alex, that was all that mattered. They sat together in the backyard that evening, the autumn air crisp against their skin, their breath visible in the cool air. Max rested his head on Alex's lap, looking up at him with those soulful eyes. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but in that moment, Alex realized something important. Healing wasn't about fixing everything. It was about being there, day after day, offering love and patience without the expectation that everything would be okay immediately. "I'm glad you're here, Max," Alex whispered as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. "I'm so glad I didn't give up on you." Max looked up at him, his eyes full of understanding. No words were needed between them. They had found each other in the quiet, imperfect way that love works, and together they would face whatever came next, because sometimes simply being there for each other was enough.